Hello everyone, Sony Femboy here, back with another video on the Ridge Racer series, and rocking a new extra thick look this time. Now, how long has it been since my last Ridge Racer review? Oh, wow. Yeah, it's been 2 full rotations around the sun since I last talked about this series. I really need to get off my lazy ass and do another review. Anyways, where were we? Oh yeah, 1998. Aside from being arguably the second best year in gaming history, second only behind 2004, 98 was a pivotal turning point for racing games. The era of old-school 3D arcade racers had pretty much come to an end, and with the arrival of Gran Turismo onto the scene, this would also be the dawn of the simcade genre. Gran Turismo was truly like no other game of its time, with well over 100 cars, a dozen tracks, and an in-depth career with hours and hours of content. Being as content-rich as it was certainly paid off, because GT1 went on to become the best-selling PS1 racing game, and also the best-selling PS1 game period. Given this situation, Ridge Racer was at serious risk of fading into irrelevance. Within just a few short years, the first couple of Ridge Racer games had already shown their age and then some, what with the glaring lack of content the first game has to offer, and Ridge Racer Revolution simply being a somewhat lazy expansion pack to Ridge Racer 1. Ridge Racer was a good game that made some big steps forward, but it didn't make the same splash as the first game did, and was generally agreed upon as simply being good, but not great. Ridge Racer clearly needed to step up its game if it wanted to stay alive. So Namco took one look at the changing market and decided to shift into high gear with their 4th outing in the Ridge Racer series, Ridge Racer Type 4. Gran Turismo's influence on 3D racers clearly got Namco to step up their game with this one, because it marks a second shift in the series' tone. After the late 80s, early 90s cheese of the first outing, and the grungy, washed-out tone of Ridge Racer Type 4 goes for a more sleek and classy style that still has fun with itself. The menus absolutely ooze that Y2K aesthetic that is simultaneously timeless and of its time. I won't go into a tangent about how lifeless modern game menus are, I'll save that for another video probably, but man, it's incredible how these 20-plus-year-old aesthetics still manage to immerse the player even before they've set foot on the track. Stuff like this is important when making a first impression on a player. Once you are on the track, you will notice the major step up in visuals. Ridge Racer 4 is one of those system-pushing titles, in some ways looking even better than Gran Turismo. The pre-baked lighting and shadows look spectacular and add a great level of atmosphere to the more realistic tracks this game has. We don't have a day and night cycle like the first game. Actually, I don't think Ridge Racer had that either, but with 8 tracks total, each in different locations now, there is great variety that was sorely lacking in the earlier entries. Not to mention great attention to detail, with moving parts in the background. Not even Gran Turismo had this. Outside of the track in that game was purely static. This game is honestly one of the very best looking games on the system. And of course, there is the soundtrack. I don't think there's really a bad Ridge Racer soundtrack out there. The strongest candidate for that is Unbounded, simply for trying way too hard to pander to the early 2010s dubstep craze. That sure as hell hasn't aged poorly. I think most will agree that Type 4 has one of the best soundtracks on the PS1, and quite possibly the best Ridge Racer soundtrack period. This one delves into jungle, drum and bass, and techno, and it really fits the cleaner and more modern look Type 4 goes for. There's the occasional trip into techno metal on a few tracks that, as a fan of both jungle and metal, honestly makes me want to nut. On the whole, Type 4 probably has the best aesthetic of the whole series, and that's coming from a series that is honestly kinda fueled by aesthetic. But moving on to gameplay. Before I get into the gameplay proper, I'd like to talk about the story. Yes, you did hear that right, story. How many other arcade racing games out there were doing stories at this time? I mean, sure, there might have been some others, but Ridge Racer 4 is the first one of the 90s that comes to mind. There are 4 different story paths depending on which team you choose, and they are honestly pretty well written. Hell, there are even moments that can choke you up a little bit. I mean, the stories in this game aren't too deep or anything, but for a racing series dipping its toes into storytelling for the very first time, they pulled it off pretty damn good. Now, gameplay. Ridge Racer Type 4 is where the series finally gets controlled down right. For the first time ever, drifting is intuitive and controls flawlessly. Not all cars have drifting mechanics, but with the ones that do, I rarely if ever had issues getting the car to drift. And once you get that part of the game down, it is a blast to play. We have 4 different teams and 4 different manufacturers to choose from. Different teams will give you different paint schemes and stories. While choosing different manufacturers has a more consequential effect, that being handling. I personally go for the drift cars for your first playthrough since those handle better and are easier going around corners. In my 2 playthroughs with grip cars, I gave up before the final race because I just kept getting stuck on the 7th race, and that's all down to the so-called grip car's handling model. There are some other issues like AI that is pretty blatantly scripted, and the fact that bumping into walls slows you down to a snail's pace. I guess that's the best they could do with the technology though. Most PlayStation racers have brain-dead AI to be honest, so I can't really expect much. Despite some of the flaws, this is the best racing the series has seen so far, not to mention having an actually decent selection of cars for once. Actually, I'm greatly underselling that aspect of the game. This game has 320 total. Okay, technically if you don't count upgrades and different paint schemes, it only has a little over 50, but that is still incredible for a Ridge Racer game, let alone any 1998 racing game period, 1999 if you live in America or Europe. This is only just after Gran Turismo, might I add, and they had already figured out one of the most important parts in making a meaty and content-rich racing game. Even Need for Speed would take another decade to reach the over 50 cars mark. And on top of that, you can race as Pac-Man. What else needs to be said? After 3 games ranging from simply good to, let's be upfront and honest, kinda bad, Ridge Racer finally figured itself out and made a bona fide masterpiece. Ridge Racer had updated itself to fit a new era, and ended up putting the well-needed final nail in the coffin for the outrun style of arcade racers that it ironically was once part of. Ridge Racer 4 is without any shadow of a doubt the best PS1 Ridge Racer, and one that has turned me into a fan of the series. The first Ridge Racer game I ever played was Ridge Racer 1, which, having been spoiled by the likes of Gran Turismo, I honestly thought the game kinda sucked. What with it only having 2 tracks and like 8 cars. Like it all you want to, but there's little reason to go back and play Ridge Racer 1 outside of learning racing game history. And that gave me the impression for the longest time that the Ridge Racer series sucked as a whole, but playing Rage Racer a few years ago started to change my perception of the series, and now having played Type 4, Yep, I'm officially a fan of this series now. It is one of those series that took a while to actually get a good game out, but once they finally got it right, they really got it right. And it's a good thing that this is the Ridge Racer game that people love talking about these days. It's definitely replaced the first game as being the new face of the series, and I'm glad that people are beginning to appreciate this game as the masterpiece that it is. Forget the first two games, maybe pick up Ridge Racer, but definitely add this game to your OG PlayStation collection. It's one of the very best the system has to offer. And with that, I finally have a new video and review out. Apologies for the lack of content, folks. There's two things that have been holding me back from making videos lately. One being my Thrash Panda webcomic series. You should really check that out, by the way. I have a lot more fun dipping my toes into art and comics these days. And two, the current state of YouTube, which is to say, absolute shite. If YouTube was in the toilet back in 2016, well, now it's in the septic tank. And you do not want to be trapped in a septic tank now, do ya? Despite that, I do have something big planned in terms of new videos. And despite me planning on doing more online courses this year as well, I hope to get a big video project out before the end of the year. Anyways, this is your local Trash Panda Slayer, signing off.